Ladies and gentlemen, this is a program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Charles Lane. Charles Lane is a significant and important journalist. He sits on the editorial board of one of America's three top newspapers, the Washington Post. And before that, he graduated from Harvard, and he was a foreign correspondent for Newsweek. He's and was editor of the New Republic. You can also see him in the evenings on Fox News. He sits in the chair, as he was saying to us last night, next to that of Charles Krauthammer. And so, and provides a kind of counter-punctual voice, one could say. So he's going to talk today on Obama, what went wrong. Charles Lane.
Thank you very much. I want to start just by thanking the Program on Constitutional Government and Professor Mansfield for inviting me. As he mentioned, I did graduate from this school over 30 years ago, and this is really the first time anyone's ever asked me to come back. And it is very special because I do love this place, and to be thought of as somebody worth inviting to talk to the current crop of students and faculty is truly an honor. Although I have to say, when I first got the invitation, it said, come to the PCG. And I thought, what is that? You know, is this the private conservative group? Or perhaps it's just the pretty conservative guys. But I think what I've learned from watching the couple of YouTube videos that are out there, this is actually the perfectly consistent group because the quality of presentation before this one has been very high. That's a roundabout way of saying I certainly hope that I can rise to the level of the people before and the people who are coming after. And in that vein, I was wondering, well, what on earth can I even bring as a Washington journalist to a meeting like this, and what's the value added? I hope what I'm going to accomplish here today is just that, to kind of bring an impressionistic, but one hopes rooted in evidence, photograph of where this presidency stands just before the election, and that it will have enough point to it that this will prompt a good discussion afterwards, which is really what I'm looking forward to most. So let's get on with it. And of course, the first thing I have to say is a little bit of a disclaimer. I am a member of the editorial board, but I'm not speaking on behalf or for the editorial board or this guy, Jeff Bezos. I just don't want anybody to think that these are in any way the Post's opinions, what I'm sharing with you today. Okay, so the picture you're looking at there is not actually of February 10th, 2007. February 10th, 2007 was the date in Springfield, Illinois, when now President Obama, then Senator, announced his candidacy with this lofty promise, or I guess you'd say aspiration. The picture you're looking at is of Berlin about a year and a half later, where he spoke to a very excited throng. But I put them together because I think they help us to recall the huge expectations that awaited this presidency. They were widely shared, those high expectations, by my very own newspaper. And I think this was a kind of typical statement or expression of what people thought the Obama presidency might mean. And if you look at it, what you see is a good deal of belief that the personal attributes of Barack Obama could translate into results in terms of the public's kind of spirit and mindset. If you go through this, I think is a not wholly representative, but relevant paragraph of this editorial, it doesn't say if Barack Obama is elected, the economy will grow 4%. It's a kind of a more abstract and loftier kind of a sentiment. 6 years later, and I repeat, I consider that post-editorial a good example of the mindset that prevailed in expectation of the Obama presidency. Look where we are, and I think these points probably don't need too much elaboration because you guys follow the news. But I would focus, interestingly, on the second one, especially. Who would have thought that 6 years into the presidency of the first African American to occupy the White House, and somebody who had been elected, I think, on a actually quite rational hope that this would be a breakthrough in American race relations, would be presiding over the situation in Missouri, this extremely painful, ugly situation in Missouri that we're living through right now. And in fact, if you stop and think about it, he seems fairly removed from it and fairly helpless to do a whole lot about it. And I think of all the things on our list here, in a way, that might be the most poignant in light of the expectations. But, you know, the numbers are what they are. This president's favorability rating has actually gone down since I wrote this PowerPoint a week ago. It's now approaching 40 in the latest polls. And basically, he is on a trajectory, you know, present trends continue, to wind up actually where George Bush wound up at the end of his presidency. He's not that far off the favorability rating that George Bush had at this point in his career. And obviously, we all know that there's a serious risk that the Democrats will not hold the Senate. The American people are in a bad mood. Again, contrary to the kind of uplift that was expected 5.5 years ago. This wrong track, right direction measurement is not one poll, but a composite of them. And you see what I think is kind of interesting about it is that we were kind of, through 2012, the thing, we were going more on the right track in 2012. And that's kind of right where Barack Obama got reelected. And then almost the minute after he got reelected, the mood darkened again. So what did go wrong? The puzzle here is not everything has gone wrong. In fact, quite a few things have gone somewhat right. The big one to me is the economy, which I don't know if you caught the news yesterday, but they reported the lowest number of first-time jobless claims since the year 2000, 14 years ago. So, I mean, there's a lot of concern. The stock market is going up and down right now, and Europe may be a basket case. But the U.S. economy is now rated by the International Monetary Fund as the most healthy in the industrialized world. When the Washington Post had Barack Obama into our office for a meeting just before his inauguration for a big group interview, somebody asked him, well, when your first 4 years are over, what do you want to be known for, and or what do you think people should judge you by? And he immediately said, well, did we create more jobs as a country and solve unemployment? And within 13 months, I think he can plausibly claim that it at least happened on his watch. And then the rest of the list, I think you're familiar with as well, not least in terms of his accomplishments, is the most important one to him, getting reelected. And carrying the Senate for the Democrats in a year the last time around when a lot of people thought the Republicans had a very good chance. So you could make, and Paul Krugman, bless his heart, has just done it in Rolling Stone, you could, and I actually stole these points from Krugman's piece, you could make a plausible case this has actually, in a material sense, been a both substantively and politically successful presidency. Just want to throw that out at you. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is that even if this guy was not there to bother him, President Obama's time was never going to be all about just the things President Obama is doing. I mean, that isn't the way our system ever worked and still doesn't work. And so there's a lot of things that have gone wrong and that have harmed him politically and that have undercut what I would call like the original theory of his presidency that were outside of his control. And one of them, illustrated by this picture, very mean picture of Mitch McConnell, is that he's faced extraordinarily intense Republican opposition. I would argue that, in fact, the Republican opposition is more intense than the Republicans themselves probably intended it to be in 2009. I know that Mitch McConnell famously said, you know, we got to make sure this guy is a one-term president, and that he held these meetings in January 2009 where he told everybody to obstruct and so forth. But I don't even think Mitch McConnell realized how powerful the Tea Party was going to be in 2010. And I think the Republicans have been pushed by their base in a significant way to oppose pretty much everything President Obama does. You can look at the rest of the list, and I think those are fairly self-explanatory. But I just want to say a word about the last one, since the C does stand for constitutional. This was always, the United States of America is not set up for the rapid, easy passage of comprehensive national legislation. That isn't, if you look at our history, that doesn't happen on a routine and regular basis. At least that's the way I read it. And so the mere fact that, albeit on a very partisan basis, a healthcare reform statute got through it was not what I expected after Scott Brown won election in January, or whether December or January at that point. And in any case, the system is not set up for dramatic, swift results, even in a situation, as point one there illustrates, where you're inheriting a crisis that, at least to many people, seems to demand that kind of swift and sweeping response. Okay, so what then, with those caveats, what can we say went wrong here? And I think the first part of the problem, and this is both a substantive and a political point for the president, is that a lot of this good news is not due to things he did. The Federal Reserve, by far, is mainly responsible, and people understand that, for the economic recovery. And the other thing that happened that no one banked on was the oil and gas boom in Texas and North Dakota due to fracking, which has been a huge bailout to the U.S. economy. I don't think gets enough discussed, even though it's discussed a lot. He could have done, I mean, another thing that I remember very vividly from that meeting with Obama in January '09 was that my boss, Fred Hyatt, asked him about his commitment to entitlement reform and, you know, reforming Medicare for the long term, Social Security for the long term. And Obama emphatically said that this was something that could not wait another 8 years, and that, I can't remember his exact words, but they were essentially that he didn't want to kick the can, I think he used that phrase, didn't want to kick the can down the road anymore. I would argue, and I think there's evidence in Bob Woodward's book and other places, that there was a good opportunity to do that through a deal with John Boehner. The White House ferociously disputes that. But the fact that that handoff got missed, I think, is part of what people feel sour about. And then here's the really vexing thing for him and for his party. His accomplishments are unpopular. The healthcare law has been upside down in the polls since the middle of 2009, and they can't do anything about it. It's kind of amazing, because the whole theory politically of the healthcare law was that this is something that Democrats have been pursuing for almost a century, that if we can finally achieve it, it will be a capstone on our record, it will be a historic accomplishment, and by the conferral of this guaranteed benefit now on the middle class of America, it will essentially win over, not to say purchase, a Democratic majority for years to come. And the opposite has occurred. There's lots and lots of theories as to why that happened, but I don't think anybody can deny that, I think even to the surprise of the Republicans, healthcare reform has been a political failure. That's not the same as saying it's been an operational failure. I think that's a completely different question, but as a purely political question, it has failed. And in fact, I think it's very ironic, because one of the reasons the Republicans opposed it so fiercely is they were afraid it would be a political success. They were wrong. And then a final point about what has gone wrong here is, I think that so much of the legislation that President Obama and the Democrats in Congress advocate is highly complex. The health care reform we talked about, the cap and trade bill, which ultimately failed, was an extremely complex piece of legislation. Dodd-Frank, extremely complex. And that has two flaws, the first of which is obviously the substantive problem that it's hard to make a complex piece of legislation work. But that's less important for my purposes than the fact that a complex piece of legislation is easy to attack politically because you can always pick something out of it that makes the whole thing look crazy. And we're seeing, that the more complex a statute is, the easier it is to caricature because no one really can understand it. And by the way, it can also be attacked just on the accurate grounds that it's just too complex, right? So I think these laws that responded to longstanding Democratic Party interest groups and their agendas, the stimulus bill actually fits in this category too, turned off a lot of people who saw them as, the Republicans I think got a lot of mileage with this 1,000-page bill that nobody has even read problem. And so I think Obama has been perceived as making government too complex, and that has hurt him. So I'll go back in a way to where I started and try to convince you of the following. We have a kind of paradoxical situation where the presidency has sort of succeeded in practice, but really failed in theory. And the theory of this presidency was that, as I put it in that first point there, we can transform a nation by electing a president. Now, I know presidents and presidential candidates say that a lot. I have the feeling, and since I'm not a quantitative political scientist, I'm allowed to say this, I just have a feeling that this time the promise was more powerful and taken more seriously, as I'll try to illustrate in a moment, by more people. And people really seemed to believe that we were in the midst of a movement that was headed by Barack Obama that was going to transform our venal world of politics into something more ennobling. And the second point, I think, is especially central to this. You have to look back to the environment in which Obama not only won the presidency, but in which he announced his candidacy, which, as we pointed out before, was February 10th, 2007, a time when the surge was still, it was unclear whether the surge was going to succeed in Iraq. And the basic view of the predicament the United States was in was that we were because of this failed and costly adventure in Iraq, we had made ourselves kind of an international, almost a pariah. I used to call this the bag over your head phenomenon because a lot of us felt like when we went to Europe, we had to wear a bag over our head because of George W. Bush and the torture and Iraq and the Guantanamo and all that. And Obama, I think, thought or was advertised as somebody, because of who he is, can rebrand America, restore the international standing of the United States just by the phenomenon of his being elected. That's my old friend Andrew Sullivan, who I think everyone's old friend, Andrew Sullivan, who I say has put on a few pounds since he was my boss years ago, but that's cover up the camera for that remark. And you read through this essay, and I think this is almost like a chemically pure expression of the mentality I'm trying to describe. It's all about who Obama is. It's all about his identity and the sort of curative potential of that identity, right? And the sectarian and racial divides he's alluding to there are very importantly to do also with what was then, and I think today still is, but less dramatically perceived to be this kind of clash that we had provoked with Islam around the world and it was draining our international legitimacy. Has everybody managed to read through all that?
No, give us time.
What you'll notice in the statement there is there's almost nothing in there about any concrete policy measure or tangible change in the law or legislation, which is why I allude to the magical thinking that it embodies. But in case you think Andrew is just some wackadoodle journalist like me, look at what other ostensibly very sober political people were saying. John Kerry pretty much said the same thing when he endorsed him over Hillary Clinton in April of 2008. And lo and behold, Barack Obama himself seemed to subscribe to this, what I'd call magical thinking about his potential presidency. And, you know, I think it's important to point out that to the degree the public had this view of the potential benefits of an Obama presidency, it was something he encouraged, or his campaign encouraged. I'm not sure they set out exactly with that in mind, but once that ball started rolling, I think they decided to go with it. Of course, we remember that he burst on the scene in 2004 with that unifying vision that he articulated at the Democratic National Convention. There is no red America, there is no blue America. And I think they decided to milk that even more in '08. Well, in honor of Anna Schmidt, I decided to include a German reference. This is also a tribute to my social studies background here at Harvard. If you want to explain what went wrong here, you could do a lot worse than consult Max Weber, who would have immediately recognized two things that were wrong with this, the two design flaws: the reliance on charismatic authority, number one, and the conception of politics as some sort of area in which human redemption is available. And no, it is a strong and slow boring of hard boards, right? By the way, I think that's the way Mitch McConnell looks at it. And he's a hard board. I've gone over some of this already, but an additional point I want to add is the third one, that Obama got into the race to end the war in Iraq. And by the time he was elected, a couple of things had shifted out from under him. Number one, the war wasn't going so badly anymore, right? The surge had actually worked, at least temporarily. And we had a global financial crisis on our hands that had effaced Iraq as the number one issue on everyone's mind, at home and abroad. So he kind of ran to solve one problem and got elected when everybody wanted him to solve another one. He was, in that sense, I think, uniquely, or not uniquely, but kind of disadvantaged for the fixing the economy task compared to the fixing Iraq task. At the end of the day, you can end a war by just quitting. You can just pull your troops out and have done with it, more or less. But at home, where he had to work with Congress and work with a lot of other institutions, the business community, labor, all the others who care about things like mortgage rates and bank regulation and on, that is the sort of arena of the slow boring, or whatever it is, strong, slow boring of hard boards. You have to really, get your arms around coalition building, legislating, the details of policy, and so on and so forth. And I think Sean Wilentz had it right that was a chore for which somebody with a kind of post-partisan, redemptive view of his mission as president was not well prepared or well suited. And so now he's reaping a little bit of the condemnation of some people who do see, within his own ranks actually, in his own party, who do understand politics as the slow, boring, or strong, slow, boring of hard boards. And I think the most damning really is from Leon Panetta. And that's because I know a lot of people look at people like Leon Panetta as just Washington insiders and stuffed shirts and so on. But even discounting for that, Leon Panetta does have a pretty good reputation in Washington as a straight shooter and as somebody who doesn't necessarily have a personal axe to grind about this. And the comments that he made to our paper about 10 days ago are, if you think about it as an assessment of someone's leadership, extremely damning. Because basically what he's saying is that Barack Obama gives up. You know, he kind of quits in the middle of these struggles that go on in the legislative process and so on and so forth. I think it's very, very cogent, but slightly unfair in the sense that one of the things Obama has attempted to do to get around all of this opposition is the executive action thing, which we can talk about more, but I think that at least does suggest that he's trying to fight. But what I think Panetta has in mind here is that he's not willing, rather than use the word fight, he's not willing to engage. He's not willing to go to his fellow Democrats on the Hill and say, hey guys, I need the 10 of you to vote for this and the 12 of you to do that. And I think it's true based on the conversations I've had with members of Congress. I mean, we had, how can I say this without violating confidence? I have had a conversation with a Democratic senator, went like this. When was the last time you talked to the president about the issue you care about most? And he said, I think it was 4 years ago. Right? And there's a lot of stories like that in Washington. So here we are. These, I wonder if they're very clear, but these, I think for the original theory of this presidency, these are very troubling results. In the Middle East, where this presidency was supposed to be the most transformative in terms of the U.S. position and legitimacy, we're viewed the worst. And foreign policy, which again was at the heart of the original case for Obama's election, he's now rated lower on foreign policy leadership than on leadership in general. You can see that he kept a high rating on that for quite a long time, but even now that's lost. And I'm sort of listing a few possible reasons there on the left. I think it's not over yet. At this time in Bill Clinton's presidency, I think he was facing impeachment. Is that right? Or maybe he had just admitted that he had actually done something with Monica Lewinsky. But he seemed like he might be about to get impeached. And I mean, that's a special case, to put it mildly. But it ain't over till it's over. But I think a lot of things are going to have to change for this presidency to end on an up note, either for the president himself or the country. It so happens that there is a lot of legislation that would make a difference that is kind of teed up in Congress in the sense that it has demonstrated bipartisan support. One of them that I don't have on this list here, but it may seem like a small thing, but I don't think it is the Keystone Pipeline. Others include reforming this bankrupt postal service we have, the transportation bill. I think maybe even immigration. These things could get done. And if Harry Reid is, as majority leader, has been preventing floor votes on any Republican amendments for political reasons, if he's out of the way, it may actually be more likely that a Republican-controlled Congress could cut some of these hard deals with Obama. They would be on terms less favorable to Democratic positions, obviously, but in some cases, we can talk about this more later, the distance is so small that it's not implausible to think about actual compromises occurring. And I think for that to all take place, though, my last note there, I think, would have to be fulfilled. I think he would have to get over a lot of the magical thinking, I guess, that was kind of, that he sort of both represented and that he participated in a little bit in terms of his conception of the presidency, and have to settle for less, as it were, in dealings with the Republicans. We can talk more about the eternal question of who's been more to blame, the Republicans or the Democrats, for all the various failures, but I do think that to the extent that the resistance of the president and his party to certain compromises that were a little more plausible than they say is part of the problem, that has to be resolved. I will leave you with this additional quotation from Max Weber. These are, I know Machiavelli is pretty cool, but I think this is one of the finest statements about politics and what it really means that I've ever read. And I think this is the kind of thinking that we needed more of at the beginning of this presidency, not just by the president, but by all of us. I think even in this room, there are probably some people who voted for Barack Obama, maybe even twice. And to the extent any of them voted, yeah, we'll be taking down your names after lunch. This is the attitude, right, with which we have to approach the job of politics more in Washington. I tend to think because it's pretty unavoidable. Okay, I will stop there, and thank you again for having me. I hope that I can answer any questions that you have, or we'll just kick some things around and have a good discussion.
Thanks very much. So, Jim Hankins.
Very interesting presentation. Thank you for letting me see how this looks to someone who's not, someone sort of, I think, moderate Democrat. I would not put the successes and failures in the same order at all. You didn't talk very much about race, and a lot of what people look for, the only reason I was tempted to vote for Obama, I didn't vote for him, unlike the would-be Senator Grimes, I admit that. The only reason I was tempted to vote for him was the fact that he was black. I thought, racial healing, we need this in the country. I don't like any of his policies, although of course he was disguising what his policies were going to be. We didn't really know what he was an empty. He didn't have any. He didn't come out of the closet at all as a progressive during the election. He was just hope and change. We know what that amounted to. I was tempted to vote for him because of race. And when he was elected, I said, now they're not going to be able to say that America is racist anymore because we've elected a black president. That's what people like me were saying. And that's a great accomplishment in America. But what happened was that race became racially became much worse. And every time anyone opposed a policy of Barack Obama, they were labeled as a racist. And people don't like that. And that's part of the reason for the, and even to this day, the only thing I like about Barack Obama is the fact that he's black. But whenever I oppose any policy of Barack Obama, I'm accused of racism, right? So I think people are very disappointed about that they expected some kind of post-racial America to emerge from Barack Obama, and it didn't happen. And one other thing I wanted to say is, I don't believe that there is that Obama will change his stripes at all. If there's a Republican Senate in there, I think everything that they propose to the president will be batted down. And the reason I think is that it will be vetoed, I mean. He's extremely partisan. And that's the other thing that's been very disappointing to people. He publicly denounces Republican leaders at public meetings where it's televised He denounced the entire Supreme Court, and as you remember, in the State of the Union address. He goes around the country essentially accusing Republicans of being tools of the devil. And it doesn't make for post-partisan politics, doesn't make for effective government. I think people who understand a little bit about American government know that you have to reach out, you have to compromise, you have to bring in people in the office, you got to bang some heads against. He doesn't do that. He pouts when people refuse his grand vision. He doesn't engage with people, not just the Democrats. He hasn't been talking. I think he's even less accommodating towards Republicans, and he assumes that they are acting from the worst motives all the time. He doesn't know how to create any type of common sense of the common good. And that I think is the second thing that's really, that people object to a lot in him as a leader, is he's very partisan, and he is not someone who compromise. He's always trying to get more than a compromise situation would allow. So that's what my view of him as a leader.
I feel like I'm back on the panel at Fox. Let me see how can I respond to that? This partisanship thing, well, the polarization and partisanship are not the same. So what we have, though, unfortunately, they're not the same things in principle. We have right now in America is a very toxic combination of the two. My short answer to you is there's plenty of evidentiary material to support your view, and I would add it is a two-way street. Because Mitch McConnell did say...
Of course. And so did Rush Limbaugh and people like that.
Yeah. So I want to talk, though, about the racial issue in the context of my friend Mr. Weber there. And don't take this the wrong way, but anybody, any of us who voted for Barack Obama on the theory that the election of a black president would cure America's racial ills was just being foolish. It is, talk about hard boards. That's the hardest one in our entire society. And I think the Ferguson example illustrates it. So that I think you, and again, I don't mean this in an impersonal sense, but I think what you're stating there is a commonly held magical thought about the impact of an Obama presidency. By the way, I think in a weird way that's a huge tribute to America, is that so many people had that wish, you know, that magically we can finally throw off this terrible albatross that's been around our necks for 300 plus years. And I think it just ain't that simple. And I think it's going to await a really astute, nuanced historian, right, to 20 or 30 years from now, evaluate the impact of the Obama presidency on American race relations. I think it's way too early to say it made them worse, right? And, but a final point about that, I think one of the key moments in this presidency came very early and happened right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was the arrest of Skip Gates. When the president blurted out that the police had been stupid. You can go to the Pew Research Center polling on the favorability rating of Barack Obama among whites to that date, and it goes like that.
And if we add Ferguson to that, and
Ferguson
treatment of the police.
I think that's a more complicated case, but I wouldn't disagree with you in principle. But what I'm saying is that what happened in that moment, right here in the neighborhood, was a sense that, wait a minute, he really is on one side in this racial thing.
And Eric Holder is too.
Well, okay, hold on. But I think that was a huge mistake for a man who previously had been very, very careful not to appear to take sides on race. And I think since then has been more careful. And I think that was kind of one of those things that just happens in a presidency. And because of poor planning, because of poor thinking, because of just human nature, he did himself a lot of harm. And I think from that moment on, it became a lot easier for people to portray him as a racial inciter or side taker or whatever than it had been previously. Anyway.
Yes, Ross.
Charles, with many of your points I agree, but I put it to you that in a way nothing went wrong. Obama was a very left-wing character. People who dug into the new party in Chicago and how he got the position as a Democrat in the state legislature have shown that. And it's a classic story in European politics, also in Australia where I come from, that the party that wins by left of centre it takes in now and then appealing recruits for its cause. That's the story of him getting into the Illinois legislature. He was elected because of his persona, as you have pointed out, but the policies, I think he still believes in them, and he wasn't rejected in his public opinion because of his post-partisanship. I don't think the post-partisanship meant very much for him, as for some Republicans who've made the same. The magical thinking, yes, because that stemmed from this social engineering mind. And he was unable to work with the Republicans because they weren't convinced, and in the end the nation wasn't convinced of the wisdom of this social engineering. And he tried through the IPA and through the environmental.
Oh, EPA.
The EPA and through.
That's just his Australian accent.
And through Eric Holder. This is Sidney and Beatrice Webb's social engineering by the administrative state. And of course, he pouted and was disappointed. But it wasn't because he thought he was going to straddle the divide. I think he thought that these policies would be welcome.
Well, I said that, and I think that especially with respect to healthcare and his foreign policy, he very much believed that the American people wanted a left, so to speak, a left turn. And it wasn't that they didn't want it, it's that it was just a lot more complicated than that. I mean, for what it's worth, my take on what Americans want out of healthcare is they want a whole lot of great services and for free. That's what the American people want. And nobody is telling them the truth, which is, well, that isn't really possible. And so when people say Obama lied about keeping your doctor, that's just a minor lie compared to all the lies our politicians tell us about the realities of reforming healthcare, right? And so part of the problem is just that when you, as I'm trying to illustrate, when you actually get down to the brass tacks of legislating in the real world, you start turning people off. Having said that, I actually agree with you that in addition to this kind of redemptive post-partisan theory that he put out, he is, in his interior, I think he's a man of what passes for a left in the United States. Absolutely, I agree with that. I think he has an ideology. I don't think he's non-ideological. And actually, maybe a better word than post-partisan would be sort of post-political, was kind of what he was selling. But you have to bear in mind that right now, the attitude in the Democratic Party is the party's very divided now, and he's being attacked from people who say he's not far enough to the left. What I'm getting at here is that whether he was bound and determined to go left from the beginning or not, that was kind of never gonna work. And when it ran up against all the realities we're talking about here, he was bound to find himself in more political trouble. Anyway, that's.
Faulkner, if, I would welcome questions from the younger people in the audience if you want to think of one. But go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to mention the name of Eric Holder, an extremely able man, but was abrasive on racial questions in a way that contributed to what you've just discussed. I'd be interested in your own opinion of Holder.
Well, I'm from Washington, and I've been watching Eric Holder since the days he was a judge on the local Superior Court in Washington, and he was the U.S. Attorney for Washington. And one of the things that I keep reflecting on about Eric Holder is how much he has changed, or if not changed, you know, how much the world has changed and he's adapted to it or something, because the Eric Holder who almost became mayor of Washington at one time was a very moderate figure. He's extremely popular in the white community in Washington, was considered to, at one time, to be a mayoral candidate who could bring together a city that was divided by Marion Barry and so on and so forth. I don't think you can ignore that aspect of Eric Holder's history, because I think it's part of who he is. He is not a natural racial insider, to the contrary. So there's a bit of a mystery to me in that role, in his playing that role in the eyes of some. I think that I would actually encourage people to look at the recent history of the ideological positions of the Justice Department under both parties, and I would contend that what we have here is a department that is susceptible to ideological capture by the extreme Republican conservatives and the extreme Democratic liberals. If you look at what it was like under Ashcroft and Gonzalez, and what it's like today, there's a great ideological polarization among young lawyers, as between the American Constitution Society on the one hand and the Federalist Society on the other. These folks populate the Department of Justice. That Office of Civil Rights is just like a hotbed of, I mean, you know, when the Democrats control it, the most left-wing Democrats go right there, and when Republicans control it, the most right-wing Republicans go there. And I think that's of a piece with what's happened to the judiciary committees in the House and Senate. They're the playground of the most ideological members of the House and Senate. So I see, to the extent what you're saying is accurate about Holder, I think it's a reflection of a much broader trend in the law and in the kind of lawyers who get involved in government and politics in this country. It's been a long time since we had a sort of, I don't know, who was a great, nonpartisan, thoughtful, deep attorney general who was respected and, you know, was a wise person in the law. I mean, that kind of attorney general.
Sounds like John Mitchell.
Yeah, John Mitchell, right. But, you know, I think there has been a real evolution in the kinds of people who gravitate to the Justice Department. I just want to remind you that Eric Holder, I'm really going to have to trade in my Fox News badge by the end of this lecture, but I would just remind you that Eric Holder is under ferocious attack now from the left because he did not jail more bankers, right? And I happen to be, and I've written this in the column, I happen to be one of the people who think that was absolutely the correct thing to do. I think he resisted demagogues in that instance. He was advised correctly by his criminal division guy, Lanny Brewer, that there was no statutory basis for jailing bankers, and he proceeded accordingly.
He didn't jail any, apparently.
Yes. I would remind you that he is also under ferocious attack for defending the NSA surveillance programs and other such exercises of governmental authority. So it's not a one-way street. And, you know, let's be realistic here. The Democratic Party's base are black voters. I mean, what do you expect? Do you think they're going to just go into Washington and say, okay, you guys, you don't get anything? I mean, really? So, of course, there is a political pressure on this administration to deliver something for the people who voted for them. That's normal. And I think a lot of what Eric Holder has done in that department is a simple reflection of that. And I think it would be extremely strange if a certain group of people gave this administration 95% of their votes and then were told to go get lost. So I think we just have to be a little realistic about it.
Yes.
Well, I'd say the base is black voters of Wall Street. which would be part of the bankers.
It's a strange coalition.
Yeah, but I sort of agree with you. I don't think it's political ideology. He's less left-wing than people thought who looked carefully at his voting record beforehand. What's dismaying people is administration, things like the Obamacare rollout, and foreign policy. And there's kind of an I told you so there, because back in 2008 people were saying he seems to have no interest or background in administration or foreign policy. And as you said at the start, the big thing is to get at this sort of the dream of persona of Barack Obama. And I wonder if it's just he was a black man who went to Harvard Law School. Wasn't that enough to win? Nothing else. And so it's really, as somebody was saying, the fact that America is so kind of pro-black instead of anti-black that is the explanation for everything that's happened since then. So it's kind of a very simple explanation.
Well, you would get some pushback from some people I know on that point. One of the most difficult things to assess, honestly, in this entire presidency is the role of race. I mean, because it's very difficult to probe that with any accuracy about anything. People lie about two things in America: race and sex. They lie about them all the time, their true feelings. And even when they think they're telling what they really think, they may not be. And so I kind of throw up my hands on that issue, because I do think there are certain, I mean, to just try and put a little flesh on the bones of what I'm trying to get across here, I think there are lots of people in America who either hate Obama or hate him more than they would otherwise because he's black. But I don't think any such person was ever going to vote for a Democrat to begin with. See what I mean? And so you're left with sort of trying to measure the intensification of hostility to Obama that might be true because of his race. And over here on the other side, I think it is probably more true that a kind of, as this gentleman over here expressed, there was a certain kind of goodwill vote among skeptical whites who might otherwise have supported John McCain because they thought it would be kind of a good historical thing for the country. I think there was a certain percentage of people who voted that way. But I don't think that was, in the big scheme of things, I don't think that was I don't think that was decisive. I mean, I think what was decisive was Bush was exhausted, McCain appointed Sarah Palin, and Obama had, not done anything to disqualify himself during the campaign, and then people started coming up with reasons why they were going to pull the lever for him. So, on the question of the role of how much race plays in the difficulties he's having now, I kind of throw up my hands and I say there's probably more racism than people would like to admit, but not as much as some people allege, and we're left trying to figure out what it is in the middle. And I really do think that if he had somehow managed to, you raised foreign policy, if he had really managed to rebrand America the way he promised and the way a lot of people expected, this conversation would be a lot different. Because I think a lot of his current political troubles are, and this is somewhat surprising, traceable to the mess in the Middle East, which just has the sense of something like it's completely chaotic. People are getting their heads cut off, and we can't do anything. And that's because we pulled out, and that was Obama's idea, and he drew a red line, and then he pulled back. And in that particular area, there's an especially strong nexus between the failure to make the magic work and actual, visible, bad results, right? Anyway.
Who would you say are or have been the best people in the Obama administration?
There's some good ones. I'm glad you put it in a positive way, Harvey, because you didn't ask me to list who the worst were. But I thought, I'm going to get a lot of rolled eyes. I thought Tim Geithner was actually a pretty good Treasury Secretary, and surprised a lot of people by recovering from that unfortunate start. I think right now he has a very capable economic advisor called Jason Furman. We talked about him last night. I think went to this college. That must be why I like him so much. I think that Jay Johnson, who's now the head of Homeland Security, is an extremely able, level-headed person. I think that you know, he's very controversial and he knocks over a lot of furniture. But when he was around, I think Rahm Emanuel provided some needed adult supervision. To anticipate a question, I didn't talk about it in my presentation, but I think there is a strong school of thought now in Washington that the best people are all former officials, and you're into like a sort of early onset case of second-term itis with the staffing up of the administration. And that he is increasingly reliant on a small group of loyalists, I think the names are familiar to you from the press, who kind of don't provide him with the kind of feedback he needs. And I think there is a good deal of truth to that, but, and this is where Mr. Panetta is maybe part of the problem, not part of the solution, we do have a situation now in Washington where you cannot speak frankly for fear that somebody is going to write a book about you. We're all laughing, and it is kind of funny, but it is a real issue. And so I would mitigate, I think it's an actual flaw of the Obama administration that he has this thing of three or four, Dennis McDonough and Valerie Jarrett and nobody else, but you can kind of understand it in the sense that he doesn't really trust, he doesn't really have a good reason to trust anyone else. But if I can just go one more second on that, I think this is something we didn't understand well enough at the beginning of this presidency, but a major deficit. People say he was inexperienced. A deficit that was unexpected but very real and turning out to be very important now. Not so much the lack of experience as the lack of a network. Okay? Somebody like Bill Clinton had, you know, the friends of Bill, who ran from Little Rock to San Francisco and to Washington and then back again. Because he'd been in politics and glad-handing and a governor for 20, 25 years. And so when the first bunch were exhausted, he could bring in a bunch more and, you know, work that way. And Obama came to Washington with a very thin network. And when he got here, he was kind of a loner in the Senate. And you see, when he started to populate his first administration, I mean, he'd never met Tim Geithner before. But like somebody told him, you should meet Tim Geithner. And then a couple days later, he's Treasury Secretary. I mean, not literally never met him before, but had barely met him. And a lot of these positions were assigned in that way, including positions fairly close to him in the White House staff. And I think that's been a subtle problem all the way along.
Are there people in academia whom he especially consorts with? Or
And
you know what?
That sounds rather risque. I don't work for the National Enquirer, Professor. I'm told that he was pretty good friends with Skip Gates and Charles Ogletree at one time. He periodically, and other presidents have done this, he periodically calls in academics, you know, to sit around the table and think they're great thoughts with him. But beyond that, I can't really limit that.
Yes.
So you said that it's going to take a very nuanced historian to do a good analysis of race in the Obama administration, but I'd like to put you on the spot if I can, because I guess it's a young people thing to just want to think forward a little bit. How do you think his impact, so I guess I'll preface it with, in my mind, a couple of the things you mentioned are defined by Obama's ideology, not his race, right? He doesn't want to do anything about ISIS, arguably because he's anti-colonialist. He hates the idea of a strong America. Like, he wants healthcare because social engineering, it's ideological.
Yes.
So how successful do you think someone can be in the future running on the platform of I'm different because of my race, if we've seen such a horrible, you know, failure or a proof that that's in fact not true, and really what defines people is their ideology?
I think she wants to ask.
I would just like to add too, especially with Hillary Clinton's potential candidacy, to add the component of gender in future elections and how that might shape the conversation.
Well, that's a great way to put the question, because there was an old Doonesbury cartoon, I can't remember when it was, but they were the characters were discussing the possibility of a black president, and one of them said, the first black president will be a conservative. Think about how Fox News would be covering this administration if it were the Clarence Thomas administration, right? I mean, by the way, I think that's a great thought problem for those who think that race has determined the right's attitude toward Obama, because I think Clarence Thomas would be wildly popular as in a slightly different way Bobby Jindal is. My own thought is that I would be surprised if there's ever another Democratic national ticket that does not contain at least one person of color, ever again. And I think that is for a very straightforward demographic reason, right? Which is that the party's base now is kind of, I mean, I think this is actually a very troubling aspect of what's going on in American politics, is that the Republicans are becoming a white male party. And that's a big problem. I think it's a big problem for them. I think it's a big problem for everybody. But, you know, the mirror image of that is that the Democrats are becoming the party of blacks and Latinos in terms of the voting base. And so I would be amazed, and of course I'm speaking in very rough terms, but I think the data bear those trends out. I mean, the number of white men in a state like Alabama, for example, who voted Democratic in the 2012 election is less than 10% of white men voted for the Democratic. Think about that. In Alabama, the state that gave us, you know, George Wallace's Democratic Party. So I think you will probably see at least one person of color on the Democratic ticket in 2012. And I think to your question, it's highly unlikely, sorry, 2016, you're right. See, I'm such a great political analyst, I don't even know when the next election is going to be. But I think that the role of women in the Democratic Party is now determinative. I mean, the gender gap is immense. If you look at this campaign right now, all the advertising is aimed at young women. And I think that is creating a kind of momentum behind a woman being on the national ticket in 2016, whether it's Hillary or ends up being Elizabeth Warren or somebody else. There's a lot of pressure for that. And when I say pressure, I mean pressure. I think inside, you go to the political professionals in the Democratic Party, many of whom are women, are basically demanding, we can't go through another election unless we have a woman on the national ticket. So I think those are kind of the realities. And the Republican, what the Republicans will probably do is sort of try to come up with somebody, dip into the narrow ranks of minorities who belong to their party and put one of them on the national ticket to kind of counter that. But you know, we'll see if it works. I think it's to go to the part about ideology in your question, it's a job for that future historian to figure out whether this ideology would have been better received if articulated by a white person. Or if, on the contrary, it got a better hearing or a more favorable hearing because it came in the package of somebody who was thought, because he was black, to be a uniter. I don't pretend to have an answer to that, but I do think that's the question. I hope that was responsive to what you said.
I'm probably the only person here who not only voted for Obama, but voted for Obama 4 times since I was from New Hampshire.
I thought you put 4 ballots in the box. I told you this voter fraud thing is a real problem.
So I'm inclined to agree with you that a lot of the things that have been attributed to Obama are more structural, especially partisan polarization. But I was really struck by what you said about complexity. That's a very important point. And I was wondering if you could, certainly there are 3 possible explanations: the complexity of Dodd-Frank, or the greenhouse gas bill, or especially Obamacare. One is this transformative understanding that we've been talking about. The second is, you mentioned his aloofness. So on Obamacare, he basically said to a lot of interest groups, you work out something and I will endorse it, rather than saying, here's my vision. But the third is just the density of the interest group networks, the complexity of existing policy, so you have to really patch things together. And you can look at a lot of Bush administration policies, Medicare Part D, No Child Left Behind, and you see that same thing. So I just wondered if you could say, what do you think these 3?
Well, I think to use a good social science word, it is an overdetermined problem. That everything you said could be causal, and they're all true. And I think where it hurts, well, I would add this. I think it is, and again, I'm doing my best to resist turning this into some kind of simplistic critique of his leadership style and turning this whole story into a story of a flawed leadership style. I hope I'm not quite saying that. But I do think he comes out of a milieu that embraces complexity, that favors complexity, that thinks your ability to spot complexity is an attribute, right? Remember that thing they always used to say about Reagan is like, there's a simple answer to every tough problem, then it's wrong, you know? And so the professorial side of him, the thoughtful Hyde Park side of him, the fact that he was so popular among this demographic, maybe not this room, but this demographic in 02138, reflected a normative approval of complexity. Stupid people do simple things or think that things can be simplified. Smart people, I mean, I won't name his name, but I remember talking to one of the officials who was involved in Obamacare in an interview who depicted himself as, you know, as he was trying to make the various parts of the program operate, as pulling levers, and every time he pulled one, he discovered that there was a change somewhere else, so he had to pull another lever. And he meant that in a good way, right? Whereas as I was listening to him, I thought, my God, this is what's so crazy. Okay, is that, you know, this program requires government to sit there, you know, yanking all these different levers. So I think they failed. I think one reason they produced legislation that was unpopular because of its complexity is that they did not particularly realize that people don't approve of complexity, or that complexity turns people off. And the footnote to that is that a lot of the complexity was driven by the need to satisfy members of the Democratic Party's own coalition, right? And there had to be something in these big bills for each kind of group. The Obama administration came after 8 years of Bush, and before that 8 years of Clinton, who was regarded by the bedrock liberal constituencies of the Democratic Party as an apostate who had denied them, right, what they wanted. There was 16 years of pent-up progressive demand when Barack Obama became president for detailed programs here, there, and everywhere else, right? And that, I think, fueled a lot of the sort of legislative sticking things together that wanted, particularly in the stimulus bill, but also in the cap and trade.
Well, I wanted to try to offer a critique of your evaluation, which I hope doesn't fall into the Fox News panel dichotomy. I guess I would begin by just wondering if your presentation of his presidency fails to take seriously enough his clearly stated goal to be a transformational president. He's on the record as saying that Reagan was a transformational president in a way that Bill Clinton was not. I wish to be transformational at any rate in the way that Reagan was. He also compared his first 100 days to Roosevelt and Lincoln. So in that respect, it seems as if your analysis, it almost wishes, it seemed towards the end, you almost wish to ask, can he pull a Bill Clinton or not? And that seems to be completely wrong question to address to someone who stated his aims so differently. And I don't really understand why you ended on the Max Weber quote, "Here I stand, I can do no other," but I wonder if it has an explanatory power of his psyche or his view of himself that's a little bit different than how it might have been intended in your presentation, just insofar as to say that his view is he has very specific and lofty goals for himself as a world historical leader for the United States to transform, and he's going to try to do that, period.
Regardless, here I stand, you do another.
With the view, of course, that it's not as if he's, he's Marcus or
Mark.
It's Mark.
Yes, I know.
Yeah, but with some confidence that if he fails, the worst case scenario will go back to Hillary Clinton, and so in that respect, it seems that your analysis sort of mixes, a recognition of this vision that he had and that he still seems to have,
with sort of this, you know, lofty vision meets reality, and so you're looking at how he met reality. Whereas I wonder whether this doesn't just continue to be his reality. It's not as if he was unaware of gridlock in Washington and the federal
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I could be in denial.
So he would say he might say to he might say, well, that's, you know, this very conventional democratic, you know, journalist from Washington has a very kind of on the ground view. How are things going at year 6 of an 8-year marriage? And whereas I'm thinking, you know, in 50 years.
I would agree with that, except, well, let's put it this way. Thank you for referring to what I just did as an analysis. Secondly, I hope I didn't suggest that I don't share a lot of what you just said. I think I said that he advertised himself as transformational, and your quotes are absolutely apropos. He did say this. He did compare himself to Reagan and the others, and he encouraged that comparison. And I think he set his sights on exactly what you're describing. And it's possible that he's bound, and possible probably better than even odds, he's bound and determined just to ride out the next 2.5 years doing what he's doing. But he has been saying different things lately. I don't know if you've noticed. He has been saying things like, well, you know, I'm just writing my little paragraph here. Anybody remember that quote? You know, a lot of people had excessive expectations for me. This is really a tough business. And he has said those things in this or that interview. He has not only said things, but done things that show maybe he's not so transformational anymore, like, I don't know, bombing Syria, finally, which was something and sending American forces back into Iraq. I mean, he's absolutely, I mean, if he stood for anything, it was get out of Iraq and never ever come back. So, I mean, those things have been forced on him, but in a weird way that is a little bit of my, it's not exactly a point I'm making, it's a notion I'm throwing out about what might we expect in the next 2 years. Yours is a completely plausible scenario, that he's just going to dance with the girl who brung him, or whatever that phrase is, stick to what he knows. But
he still has the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
He still has his legacy.
He could say, I've got my legacy, I've got all these things, I'm good to go, I don't need a transportation. I'm just saying that, and maybe this is a Washington perspective, if you look, I think, and again, this is not a prediction, but it's just like a hypothesis that has more than zero plausibility. It is, never look at what people's intentions are, look at what their interests are. I don't think it's greatly in either party's interest to have the next 2 years go by in Washington with nothing to show for it. And I think you can construct an argument that a corporate tax reform bill, which I repeat, they are very close on the details of, would give each bragging rights, that a resolution to immigration during the lame-duck period of a president and prior to the election of somebody who would be having a blank slate would, you know, enable this party blame game to end. There are scenarios under which it could be in both of their interests to do a couple of things, to govern the country a little bit, right? So that each can go into 2016 when there's no incumbent on the ballot and have something positive to say. That would be my theory of the way their interests line up. Because actually, you know, and there's a subtlety here. We don't know who the Democratic nominee is going to be. Everybody thinks it's going to be Hillary Clinton. I'm told Joe Biden doesn't share that view. And one or two others think it's going to be them, right? So there is a little bit of problem of sort of who the sort of president behind the sitting president really is for the next 2 years, who's kind of implicitly calling the shots. But to the extent that Obama cares about setting up his successor, I think he has to do, this is my read of it, a little more than just say, we got the Affordable Care Act, which nobody likes.
I like it now.
It's sooner, any day now, it's going to be popular. I know that.
Just a minor question. I was a little surprised by your response where you suggested that it would be imperative for Democrats to include minority or women candidates in all their tickets. And because, I mean, one lesson you might draw from what you just told us is that really identity politics are a bad way for American people to do elections. We know if the American people are really smart and learn from this, they may be less inclined to vote along these things. Now, this could just be a deep-seated political reality, psychological reality. But I could imagine people like President Higgins, who initially, Obama, they thought, well, I want to see the first black president, who in 2008 would have said the same thing about Hillary, I want to see the first woman president. But now they're not so sure they want to see the first X or Y or Z in office because they got burned in that last time.
Or the first XX.
Or XX. So yeah. So do you think identity politics are just staying the same, or do you think there'll be a response, an Obama effect here, where it hurts Hillary, or
I meant it in a different way, which is that the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party are such that it will require that. Okay, that these groups sort of feel like they have a claim, and that the Latino vote is much more fluid than the black vote, but there is a strong sense among Latino Democrats that they got stiffed by this president. I mean, that they didn't get anything out of this, and so I mean there are the national ticket has to reflect the voter base to some extent, and I would be it might happen. It might be Hillary Clinton and Martin O'Malley, Governor of Maryland, who improbably is running for president. They might do an all-white ticket like that. But my hunch would be that Hillary Clinton, Deval Patrick would sort of play better with the base. I don't know if Deval Patrick's even interested, but I'm just throwing that out for you.
He's interested.
Yeah. But anyway, it was just pure interest group politics that I was reflecting there.
Yes.
First, with regard to the gender politics, it gets a little more complicated. Married women and married men voted for Romney. Unmarried women, unmarried men voted for Obama.
Yeah.
Now, it wasn't an equal split there within the numbers. I don't know if that means that the Republicans should set up a dating site.
Hookup culture is much more powerful than we knew.
I also wanted to in this objective, to find who's the real Barack Obama. For virtually his entire adult life, for 20 years, he was a member of Jeremiah Wright's church. He referred to Jeremiah Wright as his mentor, his word, not mine. We know what Jeremiah Wright stands for. He certainly has been obvious about it. Virulently anti-American, a racist, anti-white, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. He was one who put forward the thesis that the government invented AIDS to exterminate black people. I don't know if he's picked that up with Ebola. Farrakhan has said that the Ebola virus has been invented by white people to exterminate blacks. A man who stays in that church for that long and describes Jeremiah Wright as his mentor has got to have picked up the philosophy. That's what it means to have a mentor. Why is it that we don't take him in effect at his word or by his deed, that he stands for the things that Jeremiah Wright stands for, and the rest has been a careful covering of the tracks with the occasional slip that you pointed out, the Skip Gates affair, but that underneath, in terms of his point of view, we've learned over a 20-year period what he thinks.
Well, he did throw Jeremiah Wright under the bus.
Only in the middle of the campaign when he was forced to. He didn't even leave that church in advance when he was planning to make a run either for the Illinois Senate or for the presidency. Even then, he didn't abandon Wright.
Well, let me put it this way. I think that's, you will have to agree to disagree. I think that's a little overdone. But, I mean, if it's true that he's sort of been brainwashed by Jeremiah Wright, it's a good thing we have a constitution which will prevent him from being president another 2 years, more than another 2 years, number one. Number two, he has not, no one can say, I think, that he has governed America the way Jeremiah Wright would have governed America for his last 6 to 8 years. And maybe that's because he's just pretending, maybe that's he's only doing it because he was forced to, but in a way, that's what James Madison had in mind, was that even if you had a crazy fanatic who somehow managed to get hold of the presidency, there would be all sorts of other checks and balances in the system. So I guess that would be my answer to that.
Speaking of that,
I want to take I think there's one possibility for him to be a transformational president, and it's exactly on this constitutional issue, which we should be talking about. A lot of people on conservatives are very alarmed about the uses of presidential power. And I know this is a long story, and many presidents have used presidential power. He's been very explicit about how he wants to overturn Congress, and there's a lot of evidence that he wants to expand the scope of administrative law, which is under his control entirely. And there's also all these power grabs that are going on, which we're experiencing one of right now at Harvard. The education department is trying to force Title IX, supposedly somehow related to Title IX standards on sexual behavior. So the left is in our bedroom now, as well as the right. The left one's going to, but there are these.
It's almost as crowded in the bedroom as it is under the bus.
Yeah. When you put a religious conservative and a progressive in the bedroom together, you end up with Sharia. But I think that there is a possibility that this trend, and it is a trend, it's undeniable, and that the size of the government is just getting bigger and bigger. There's regulations going like this.
Well, I get it, but let me just address the executive action thing. Mm-hmm. There's a piece you might want to look up that Politico just did. I know they're the competition, but they're pretty good sometimes, where they went back and looked at the various executive actions that the president actually proposed earlier this year and whatever became of them. Yeah. And the answer was kind of almost nothing. That they turned out to have been sort of hyped. So that's one data point. The other is that there's a lot of left pushback on executive action too, and now admittedly in the national security realm.
And here too, by the way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure that's fully played out. And then the third thing is, to me, the biggest, most questionable one that he was preparing to do was the immigration sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, amnesty, parole, or whatever, to allow up to 5 million people to stay on work permits. And our very own editorial page, though very pro-immigration and indeed pro-legalization of many of those people who are here illegally, opposed that on constitutional grounds that this was just not the way it's done procedurally. To have enacted something that was sort of so clearly in an area of congressional authority on which Congress had refused to act was going to be very questionable. And believe it or not, despite tremendous political pressure on him to do it anyway, he didn't. Now you can say, one could say, that that's not what he really wants, he only did that because he was under political pressure. But what's interesting to me is that he was under political pressure and responded to it, which in a funny way is the way this system is supposed to work. And it was pressure from within his own ranks, from Democrats who were basically desperate that it would lose them their races in red states. Meanwhile, public opinion has flipped on that question, by the way. The Republican Party now is higher rated, has a higher approval rating on immigration than the Democrats, about 10 or 11 points. And I don't think that point has gone unremarked in the White House or in Hillary Clinton's proto-campaign. So I think it's an open question whether he'll ever do this promised executive action, even after the election. So I think that as aggressive as it has been in some cases, it is nevertheless still, I mean, there's still this Madisonian mechanism that in a rump fashion still works from time to time. I would just add that to me, the real one to watch, more than immigration, is going to be whether he asks Congress for approval of what they're doing in Syria, right? The expansion of the strikes in Syria, because of, my opinion, which is worth nothing, is that they need that approval, and it's just not even a close question, and that it's in fact something Obama himself expressed that he needed the last time. Remember how the red line and how he went to Congress because we got to get that. So
it's going to be, I think, a really important moment in the next 2 years as to what he is going to decide about that.
Thanks for this unconventional wisdom.
Thank you very much. He's applauding now, but later on he's giving me my real grade.